They found a fire pit. Sounds boring, right? Except this fire pit is 22,000 years old. It's in Alaska, and it just demolished a theory we've been teaching in schools for over a century. Because if people were camping in Alaska 22,000 years ago, they got there somehow. And the only route we thought existed, it didn't exist yet. So how did humans reach America? Stick around, because this discovery changes everything. Let's rewind for a second. You probably learned in school that humans came to America by walking across a land bridge from Asia. The Bering Land Bridge, sometimes called Beringia. During the last ice age, sea levels were lower, and there was this strip of land connecting Siberia to Alaska. People walked across, followed some big game animals, and boom, humans in America. Clean story. Simple. Everyone believed it. There was just one problem. The evidence kept not matching up. Archaeologists have been finding things that didn't fit. Sites in South America that seemed too old. Stone tools in caves that predated the land bridge timeline. Genetic evidence suggesting humans had been in the Americas way longer than 13,000 years. But the establishment, the academics who built their entire careers on the Bering Land Bridge theory, they kept explaining it away. Dating errors, they said. Contaminated samples. Misinterpretation. Then January 2026 happened. A team from the University of Alaska Fairbanks published findings that made it impossible to ignore anymore. They'd been excavating a site in central Alaska near the Tanana River. Remote location. Middle of nowhere. The kind of place you only get to by helicopter or a very determined hike. What they found was a circular arrangement of stones surrounding charcoal deposits. A fire pit. Burned bone fragments nearby. Stone tools. Evidence of a temporary camp. The kind of thing that would normally get a footnote in an archaeology journal. Except the radiocarbon dating came back. 22,000 years old, give or take 500 years. Which is how radiocarbon dating works at those timescales. But let's be conservative and say 21,500 years. Still doesn't matter. Because 21,500 years ago, the route we thought humans used to get to Alaska didn't exist. Here's why this is a massive problem for the traditional theory. During the last glacial maximum, which peaked around 20,000 to 26,000 years ago, there were two enormous ice sheets covering most of Canada. The Laurentide ice sheet covered everything from the Atlantic to the middle of the continent. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered the western mountains and coast. These weren't little glaciers. We're talking ice up to 2 miles thick in places. And here's the kicker. For most of that period, these ice sheets were connected. They formed a continuous barrier from coast to coast. The famous ice-free corridor that people were supposed to walk through, it didn't open up until around 13,000 to 14,000 years ago. So if people were in Alaska 22,000 years ago, they didn't walk through an ice corridor that didn't exist yet. They got there some other way. The scientific community is collectively losing their minds over this. But quietly. Because admitting you were wrong about something, this fundamental isn't great for your career. Let's talk about what they actually found at this site. Because the details matter. The fire pit itself was about 3 feet across. The stones were deliberately placed, not random. Not natural. The charcoal inside came from willow and spruce, trees that would have been growing in the area during that time period. The fact that they can identify the wood species is actually important. It confirms the dating and tells us about the environment these people were living in. The burned bones are interesting too. Preliminary analysis suggests caribou or maybe an extinct species of bison. These people were hunting megafauna. Animals that don't exist anymore. And they were processing the meat with fire, cooking it, which means they had mastered fire technology in an environment where staying warm meant the difference between life and death. The stone tools found at the site are what archaeologists call microblades. Tiny, sharp pieces of stone that would have been attached to spears or arrows. The technology is sophisticated. These weren't crude hand axes. These were precision tools that required skill to make. The stone itself isn't local. Petrographic analysis, that's fancy talk for studying the rock's composition, shows it came from a source about 200 miles away. Think about that. 22,000 years ago, people were traveling 200 miles to get specific types of stone for their tools. They had trade routes or at least migration patterns that covered huge distances. This wasn't a lost, wandering group barely surviving. This was an organized culture with knowledge of their landscape. Now here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't the first site that's challenged the traditional timeline. It's just the most undeniable one, because of how well preserved it is, and how solid the dating is. But there have been others. Down in Texas, there's a site called Buttermilk Creek. They found stone tools there, dated to 15,500 years ago. That's already 2,000 years before the ice-free corridor opened. The archaeology community argued about that one for years. Some accepted it, some said the dating was wrong. There's Monte Verde. That site has evidence of human occupation from 14,500 years ago. Chile. That's the bottom of South America. For people to get to Chile by 14,500 years ago, they had to have entered the Americas way earlier, and then traveled thousands of miles south. The math doesn't work with a 13,000 year arrival date. There's also bluefish caves in the Yukon. Stone tools and cut marks on bone from 24,000 years ago. The archaeology establishment mostly ignored that one because the evidence was less clear-cut, easier to dismiss. But you can't dismiss this new Alaska site. It's too clean. The dating is solid. All agreeing. The context is clear. This was human activity. No question. And it's 22,000 years old. So if the ice-free corridor theory is dead, what's the alternative? This is where things get fascinating, and where a lot of researchers have been pointing for years but getting shut down. The Pacific Coast Route, also called the Kelp Highway hypothesis. The idea is that humans didn't walk through the middle of the continent. They came along the coast, by boat. Here's how it would have worked. Even during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered the interior, the Pacific coast wasn't completely blocked. There were refugia, ice-free areas along the coast where life could exist. Marine resources were abundant. Kelp forests, fish, seals, shellfish. A coastal population could sustain itself indefinitely. And if you've got boats that can handle coastal waters, you can migrate. Not all at once, not in a single journey, but gradually following the coastline from Asia, along what's now the Aleutian Islands, down the coast of Alaska and British Columbia, stopping wherever there's food and shelter, moving on when resources get scarce or population grows too large. This solves the timing problem. You don't need to wait for an ice corridor to open. The coast was available much earlier, and it explains how people got to South America so fast. They weren't walking thousands of miles through unfamiliar territory. They were island hopping and coast following in an environment they understood. The problem with proving this theory has always been that the coastline from 20,000 years ago is now underwater. Sea levels have risen over 400 feet since the last glacial maximum. Any coastal sites from that period are now 300 feet below the ocean surface, covered in sediment, basically impossible to find and excavate. But this new inland site in Alaska, it might be evidence of coastal people moving inland, following rivers from the coast into the interior, hunting caribou, setting up temporary camps. The Tana River connects to larger river systems that flow to the coast. These people could have been coastal inhabitants who ventured inland seasonally. There's genetic evidence supporting this too. Studies of Native American DNA show a split from Asian populations that happened way earlier than 13,000 years ago, more like 20,000 to 30,000 years ago. There's also evidence of a population bottleneck, a period where the population was small and isolated. That fits with a coastal refuge hypothesis. A small population living in ice-free coastal areas, isolated from both Asia and the interior of America by geography and ice. Because that context makes this discovery even more impressive. Alaska was not a hospitable place. It wasn't quite as bad as the ice sheets further south. Central Alaska was actually part of Beringia, the landmass that included parts of Siberia and Alaska that weren't covered in ice. But it was cold, really cold. Average temperatures during winter could hit -40 or 50 Fahrenheit. The landscape was mostly tundra and grassland. Dwarf willows, some spruce in protected areas, but nothing like forests. This was periglacial environment. The ground was permanently frozen a few feet down. Permafrost. The wildlife was incredible though. Woolly mammoths roamed in herds. Giant short-faced bears, the largest predatory land mammals ever to exist in North America. Saber-toothed cats. American lions, which were bigger than modern African lions. Dire wolves. Giant ground sloths, species of bison and horses that are now extinct. Humans were not at the top of the food chain in this environment. They were just another mid-sized mammal trying to survive. The fact that they succeeded, that they carved out a niche in this ecosystem, speaks to incredible adaptability and intelligence. The fire pit from this site shows they had mastered fire technology. That's absolutely critical in an environment this cold, obviously. But it also provides light during the long polar winters. It's used for cooking, which makes food safer and more nutritious. It's arguably the most important technology humans have ever developed. Maintaining fire in that environment required serious knowledge: where to find dry wood in a frozen landscape, how to protect fire from wind and snow, how to transport fire from camp to camp. The hunting tools found at the site tell another story. Microblades are efficient. You can make multiple tools from a single piece of stone. If one breaks, you replace it. This is important when your nearest stone source is 200 miles away. You can't afford to be wasteful. The fact that they were traveling 200 miles for stone also tells us about social structures. Either they had trade networks with other groups, or they had seasonal migration patterns that took them to different resource areas throughout the year. Both options require social organization beyond just immediate family groups. There's speculation that these early Americans might have had larger population sizes than previously thought. The traditional model had small, isolated bands barely surviving, but if they had established trade routes, seasonal gathering places, and sophisticated resource management, populations could have been larger and more stable. The assumption was that if people came across the land bridge, they'd have stayed near the coast initially. Part of it is preservation. Organic materials like wood and bone don't preserve well in many environments. This particular site had good preservation because of the permafrost. The frozen ground protected the charcoal and bone from decomposing. If the site had been in a warmer area, there might not have been anything left to find. And part of it, let's be honest, is academic inertia. The Clovis first theory. The idea that the Clovis culture were the first people in America around 13,000 years ago was dogma for decades. Researchers who challenged it faced serious pushback. Papers got rejected from journals. Grant applications got denied. Careers stalled. It wasn't until the late 1990s and early 2000s that pre-Clovis sites started being widely accepted. And even then, anything pushing the date back before 15,000 years faced skepticism. The establishment doesn't like being wrong, especially about something this fundamental to understanding human history. This new site is different because it's so well documented, and the dating is so solid that even skeptics are having trouble finding holes in it. The research team was meticulous. They used multiple dating methods. They brought in outside experts to verify. They documented everything extensively. They knew this would be controversial and prepared accordingly. The implications of this discovery ripple out in multiple directions. First, it changes how we understand human migration patterns. Humans didn't just walk in a straight line from point A to point B. They were maritime peoples, coastal travelers, using boats and following resources. This is consistent with how humans populated other parts of the world, like Australia and the Pacific Islands. Second, it changes the timeline for human adaptation to different environments. If people were living in Alaska 22,000 years ago, they'd already adapted to Arctic conditions. That's a huge accomplishment. Modern humans evolved in Africa, a warm climate. Adapting to survive in an Arctic environment required technological innovation, cultural knowledge, and probably some genetic adaptations too. Third, it raises questions about what else we've missed. If there are 22,000-year-old sites in Alaska, what's still undiscovered in Siberia, in coastal areas that are now underwater, in South America? We might be dramatically underestimating how long humans have been in the Americas, and how sophisticated these early cultures were. There's also the question of what happened to these people. The culture that made this fire pit 22,000 years ago, where did they go? Did they die out during the last glacial maximum when conditions got even worse? Did they migrate elsewhere? Are modern Native American populations descended from them? Genetic studies might eventually answer some of these questions. Ancient DNA, if it can be recovered from sites like this, could tell us about population relationships. Were these people related to later Clovis populations? Or were they a separate group that went extinct, or was absorbed? The archaeological community is now scrambling to rewrite textbooks and revise theories. Conferences are being organized specifically to discuss the implications. Researchers who were marginalized for years for suggesting earlier dates are suddenly being vindicated. It's a paradigm shift happening in real time. But here's something most people don't realize. This discovery doesn't just matter for understanding ancient history. It matters for indigenous communities today. Native American groups have oral traditions, describing their presence in the Americas going back to time immemorial. For years, these traditions were dismissed by Western science as myths or metaphors. If humans have been in the Americas for 22,000 years or longer, those oral traditions might be more accurate than we gave them credit for. That's not just academically interesting. It has real-world implications for sovereignty, land rights, and cultural recognition. The traditional narrative had indigenous peoples arriving just before European contact. Relatively speaking, 13,000 years sounds like a long time, but in geological terms it's recent. If humans have been in the Americas for 22,000 years or more, that's a fundamentally different story. That's deep time. That's cultures with roots as ancient as any on Earth. Looking forward, this discovery is going to trigger a wave of new research. Archaeological surveys in remote Alaskan sites that were previously considered too old to be worth investigating. Underwater archaeology along the Pacific coast, looking for submerged coastal sites. Reanalysis of existing museum collections using modern dating techniques. There's also going to be interdisciplinary work. Geneticists, climatologists, geologists, and archaeologists, working together to build a more complete picture. What were climate conditions really like during the last glacial maximum? How did sea levels change over time? What migration routes were actually possible? Computer modeling is going to play a big role too. Researchers can simulate human migration patterns based on different assumptions and see which models best fit the archaeological evidence. If you assume a coastal route, what does the population distribution look like over time? Where would you expect to find sites? This can guide future excavations. The stone tool technology is another avenue for research. The microblades found at this site have similarities to tools found in Siberia and Northern Asia. Comparing manufacturing techniques, stone sources, and tool styles can help trace population movements and cultural connections across vast distances and time periods. There's also the question of what these people ate beyond the caribou bones found at the site. Isotopic analysis of bones, if any human remains are ever found, could tell us about diet. Were they eating mostly land mammals, or were they supplementing with fish and marine resources? This would help confirm or refute the coastal migration hypothesis. And here's something that's going to sound strange, but it matters. This discovery makes the story of human migration more impressive, not less. The old narrative was that humans walked across a land bridge following game animals. Pretty straightforward. The new narrative is that humans developed maritime technology, navigated some of the roughest waters on Earth, adapted to Arctic conditions, and successfully colonized 2 entire continents. That's a story of incredible human achievement. They were skilled navigators and survivors who saw a challenge and conquered it. So where does this leave us? The textbooks are wrong. The museum exhibits are wrong. The documentaries are wrong, but wrong enough that they need major revisions. The story of how humans came to the Americas is more complex, more interesting, and reaches back far deeper in time than we thought. And the best part? We're probably still wrong about some of it. This Alaska site won't be the last discovery. There will be others. Each one will refine our understanding, answer some questions, and raise new ones. That's how science works. That's how we get closer to the truth. Thanks for watching. If this kind of discovery fascinates you, subscribe for more videos breaking down the latest in archaeology and human history. New discoveries are happening constantly, and someone's got to explain what they actually mean. See you next time.